before them. I want to use this opportunity to make a few reflections about superannuation and the sustainability of superannuation more generally. We have in the around the globe, obviously, lots of very, very cheap money, and indeed people like Paul Keating argue that this actual surfeit of money that has been washing around the system was the very thing, together with a lack of regulatory oversight, led to the GFC. Now, this, of course, is creating a problem for superannuation funds. And I think we have to think very deeply about this, that superannuation is now so much part of our planning for the future, and for us to be able to manage as we inevitably become an older population, that we really have to be doing some deep thinking about superannuation and how we make it more sustainable, how we ensure that it is able to, the superannuation savings are able to generate sufficient income into the future for those people that are seeking to rely on them. And, there's some cause for concern today when you look at the profile that we have of it for our superannuation funds. So we've got almost $3 trillion in superannuation funds in Australia, and that's been projected to increase to something like $7 trillion by 2030. But today we have a very, very heavy weighting of those funds towards equities, and this, of course, creates a very real risk. And if I can just quote the former Treasury Secretary Ken Henry, and he said the heavy weighting to equities and superannuation funds is exposing the nation to a dangerous financial instability and the public to excessive risk. So we need to look at the relative the profile that we have of investment in infrastructure compared to the investment that we have in equities. Now, obviously, the driver for this move into the more risky area of equities is clearly the high level of returns. And those returns range from around 13.7 in positive territory in 2013 to a negative of 11.5 in 2009, with an average return of around 6%. So there has been lots of positives but lots of negatives, lots of risk, and that is a major problem. On the other hand, we do see that there is, within the superannuation funds that have invested in unlisted infrastructure, have had a relatively stable return, and it is cited that this is around 12% on average return. Now, whether or not these sorts of returns are now available in this world of very cheap money, of course, is questionable. But what is very, very clear, that in Australia we have very low investment in by the superannuation funds in Australian infrastructure. In fact, less than 5% of that nearly $3 trillion is invested in infrastructure within Australia. And we are seeing a trend of these super funds actually going and investing offshore. We have to ask ourselves, well, why is this? Why is it that we can't get our infrastructure funds diverted to to be utilised within Australia? And I think that there's a number of issues, probably many more than I can touch on here, but certainly I think that our bid models are flawed and are not designed to attract superannuation funds. the bid models that we have, which usually are packages involving both the putting together of the funds, the financing, and the construction, as well as the ownership and management, are usually led by consortia who bid project sponsors who take their money in the first couple of years, who have very high fees that come together. These very high fees, they're in the project very short term and they move on. But the front-end loading of that cost is very unattractive to a lot of superannuation funds, and indeed they are, given the risk that is involved in that tender process, they're very often not prepared to participate in that sort of project because of the high cost that's involved. Now, this has been reflected on in many places, and this is not a widely new idea, but certainly we saw the Productivity Commission come out and say that we have to reconsider the way in which we're putting these projects out for private sector participation. And we've had many within the super industry as well make similar comment, and indeed one of the findings of this Parliament's Infrastructure Committee went along the lines of suggesting that we started looking at things like the inverted model. If I can also say that I think that there's a particular unattractiveness, in my view, of putting the finance packaging together with the design, construct and management contract, that I think that stops us seeing the best engineering and construction response that we can get, because it depends on the sort of random grouping of construction and engineering outfits with financiers, that I certainly always prefer to see where we can to have that the DCM portion of these projects separately tendered and the finance being dealt with quite separately. That way, particularly when we've got very big projects where there is only a relatively small number of unrelated parties that can be involved in tendering for the actual construction and management of the piece of infrastructure itself, that I believe we allow ourselves to get the most creative engineering response. And it also it starts helping reduce that upfront risk for superannuation funds, because you've got more certainty when you're going into a project. You've got more certainty about what the actual cost of the construction and the physical maintenance is going to be over the life of the project. So these are very, very they're complex issues for us to deal with, but what is quite clear, that the situation we have now with superannuation funds is simply not sustainable. You cannot have, it is not sustainable for us to have such a heavy weighting towards equities with less than 5% of funds invested in infrastructure. And particularly when we see that our needs for long-term infrastructure in Perth, for example, we need a new container facility. Not something that's going to be within the scope, the capacity of the state government to build. It's the sort of project that would be an ideal project for a private-public partnership involving superannuation funds. So, with those remarks, as I say, that super is incredibly important to us, but just having accumulated the funds is not, provided the framework for the accumulation of the funds is not going to be sufficient for us to ensure that those funds are going to bring home the retirement bacon for our citizens. Thank you.